Your pepper plants are basically a slow-motion disappointment factory. You're standing there watching your neighbor harvest literal buckets of jalapenos while your plant has maybe three sad little peppers that took 4 months to produce. Meanwhile, you're scrolling through Instagram looking at people with overflowing pepper harvests, reading contradictory advice from YouTube videos, and somehow convincing yourself that buying 47 different seed varieties will solve the problem. Here's something that might shock you. The mistakes you make in the first 60 days of growing peppers will determine whether you spend August harvesting pounds of fruit or still wondering why gardening seems to hate you personally. Most people get this completely backwards. They think peppers are basically foolproof plants that anyone can grow, so they wing it with random soil and hope for the best. That's like assuming you can skip the foundation and just build the house later. If you're tired of watching your pepper plants produce more leaves than actual peppers, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. The decisions you make in the first 8 weeks of growing peppers determine whether you'll spend August harvesting or composting. Most people think peppers are basically tomatoes with extra spice, so they assume the same relaxed approach works for both. That's like assuming you can skip foundation work on a house and just fix structural problems later when you feel like it. Here's what most beginners don't understand about peppers. They're slow growers with sensitive root systems and very specific nutrient needs at different growth stages. You can't just throw them in the ground, water occasionally, and expect results. Tomatoes might forgive that approach. Peppers absolutely will not. The beautiful thing about understanding this reality is that once you know where the leverage points are, you can fix problems before they compound into total failure. But you have to recognize that most pepper growing mistakes aren't sins of omission. They're sins of commission. People do too much water, too much fertilizer, too many plants crammed into too little space. They think more equals better, when the opposite is usually true. Here's the thing that separates people who harvest abundantly from those who complain that peppers are difficult. The successful growers made better decisions during a very specific window. They understood that the first 60 days establish root architecture, nutrient uptake patterns, and stress tolerance. Everything that happens after that window is basically determined by what happened during it. If you get those first 8 weeks right, you're not just growing a plant. You're building a production system that will generate fruit for months. If you get them wrong, you're nursing a struggling plant that might survive but will never thrive. The difference between those two outcomes comes down to avoiding 7 very specific mistakes. And most people make at least 4 of them before their seedlings even develop true leaves. Before we dive into these 7 mistakes, let me be crystal clear about something. I'm not a horticulture professor, and this isn't academic advice. These are lessons I've learned from watching growers succeed and fail over hundreds of growing seasons, including my own spectacularly dumb decisions with habaneros that produced exactly 0 ripe peppers after 4 months of effort. What I'm sharing with you today are the mistakes that consistently show up in failed pepper gardens and almost never appear in successful ones. The reality is, most people approach their first pepper growing season completely backwards. They think this is the time to experiment with every variety, try random techniques they saw on YouTube, and worry about doing things properly later. But the people who understand how peppers actually grow know that your first 60 days are when small decisions create massive differences in final yield. Here's why this window matters so much. During the first 60 days after germination, pepper plants establish their entire root architecture, set up their nutrient uptake patterns, and build the stress tolerance that will carry them through the growing season. A plant with strong, well-developed roots at day 60 will produce 5 times more fruit than a plant with weak or damaged roots, even if both plants look basically identical above ground. Think about that for a second. 5 times more peppers from making better decisions during 2 months. That's the real power of understanding these early leverage points. Most beginners treat the early growing phase like low-stakes practice. They figure if something goes wrong, they can just fix it later or try again next year. But peppers don't work that way. Your growing season is roughly 150 days from seed to final harvest. The first 60 days determine the absolute ceiling for what's possible during the final 90. If you mess up the foundation, no amount of perfect care later will give you the harvest you're hoping for. So let's start with mistake number 1. And this might surprise you because it's something almost every beginner does, usually before they even plant a seed. Mistake number 1 is using potting soil designed for flowers, not peppers. I know what you're thinking. Soil is soil, right? Wrong. This single choice is why your seedlings damped off in the first 2 weeks, or why your mature plants produced a jungle of leaves but absolutely zero fruit. Here's the problem. Standard potting soil from the garden center is designed to retain moisture for plants like petunias and geraniums that prefer consistently damp conditions. It holds water like a sponge. But peppers didn't evolve in moist, temperate climates. They evolved in warm environments with well-draining soil that dries out between rain events. When you plant peppers in moisture-retaining soil, you're basically asking them to grow in a swamp. The consequence chain is brutal and happens faster than you'd expect. Wet soil leads to root rot. Root rot creates a stressed plant that can't take up nutrients properly. A stressed plant either dies during the seedling phase or survives long enough to produce tons of vegetative growth but refuses to flower. No flowers means no fruit. You just wasted an entire growing season because you bought the wrong bag of soil. The solution is simple but specific. Use a potting mix that's at least 40% perlite or coarse sand. Peppers need soil that dries out between waterings. When you stick your finger in the pot, you should feel moisture at depth but dryness near the surface. That wet-dry cycle is what forces roots to grow deep and strong instead of staying shallow and weak. Which brings us to mistake number 2, and it's directly related to the soil problem. Overwatering during the seedling phase. Most beginners kill more pepper plants with kindness than with neglect. They see a tiny seedling and think it needs constant moisture to survive. But peppers don't want to be babied. They need stress to develop properly. Here's what actually happens when you overwater seedlings. The plant never develops a reason to send roots deep into the soil because water is always available right at the surface. You end up with a shallow root system that can't support fruit production later. Even worse, constantly wet soil creates the perfect environment for damping off, which is a fungal disease that kills seedlings overnight. You go to bed with healthy-looking plants and wake up to find them collapsed at the soil line. The correction is counterintuitive but critical. Water seedlings only when the top inch of soil is completely dry to the touch. For mature plants, let the soil dry down to 2 inches depth before watering again. Stick your finger in the soil. If it feels damp, don't water. If it feels dry, water thoroughly until it drains out the bottom, then leave it alone until it dries out again. This wet-dry cycle does 2 things. First, it forces roots to grow deep searching for moisture. Second, it prevents the fungal diseases that thrive in constantly wet conditions. You're not being cruel to your plants. You're training them to be resilient. The third mistake costs you weeks of growing time, and most people don't realize they've made it until it's too late to fix. Mistake 3 is about timing. And it's sneaky because you won't see the damage until August, when everyone else is harvesting and you're still waiting for your first ripe pepper. Beginners either start seeds in February when it's still 30 degrees outside, or they wait until May and wonder why their plants never catch up to their neighbors' crops. Both approaches waste the limited growing window you actually have. Here's the Goldilocks rule for seed starting. Start your pepper seeds indoors exactly 8 to 10 weeks before your area's last frost date. Not earlier, not later. This window exists for specific biological reasons that have nothing to do with convenience. If you start too early, your seedlings will be ready to transplant outside while it's still cold. They'll sit in their containers, getting root bound and stretching toward whatever light source you have indoors. By the time you can finally plant them outside, they're already stressed and leggy. When you transplant a stressed seedling into the garden, it goes into shock and takes weeks to recover. You just lost a month of potential growing time. If you start too late, you're compressing the entire growing season into a smaller window. Your plants will flower during peak summer heat when temperatures hit 100 degrees or higher. At those temperatures, pepper flowers abort and drop off without setting fruit. The plant survives but produces almost nothing. You've basically guaranteed a mediocre harvest because you missed the timing window. The specific correction is dead simple, but requires planning. Look up your USDA hardiness zone's average last frost date. You can find this in about 30 seconds with a search. Count backward 8 to 10 weeks from that date. Mark your calendar. Start your seeds on that date. Not before, not after. Get this one thing right, and you've already beaten roughly 60% of beginners who either rush the process or delay it. Your plants will be the correct size at the correct time, ready to go into the ground when conditions are actually favorable for growth. Now here's where most people get this wrong. Mistakes 1 through 3 kill beginner plants outright. But mistakes 4 and 5 are what separate casual growers from people harvesting 50 or more pounds of peppers per season. Mistake number 4 surprises even people who've been growing peppers for years. They plant 3 pepper plants in a single 5-gallon bucket, or space them 12 inches apart in raised beds, thinking more plants equals more peppers. That's like stuffing 4 people in a closet and expecting them all to thrive. Here's the hidden cost of overcrowding that most growers never connect to their poor yields. When you cram multiple pepper plants close together, they immediately start competing for the same pool of nutrients in the soil. Their root systems strangle each other underground where you can't see the damage happening. Above ground, the dense foliage blocks airflow between plants, trapping humidity right where you don't want it. The counterintuitive reality is that one properly spaced pepper plant will produce more total fruit than 3 crowded plants combined. This isn't a small difference. We're talking about the difference between harvesting 2 pounds per plant versus maybe half a pound from each crowded plant. Here are the specific spacing rules you need to follow. For in-ground planting, give each pepper plant 24 to 36 inches of space in all directions. For container growing, use 1 plant per 5-gallon pot minimum. Large varieties like bell peppers and poblanos need 10-gallon containers if you want serious production. The disease angle makes this even more critical. When plants are crowded together, airflow drops to almost nothing. The leaves stay damp longer after watering or rain. That humid, stagnant environment is exactly what powdery mildew and bacterial spot need to spread. You can lose entire crops to diseases that you literally invited by ignoring proper spacing. The solution is simple, but requires discipline. Give each plant room to breathe. That empty space between plants isn't wasted. It's yield insurance. It's disease prevention. It's the difference between a plant that produces 30 peppers and one that produces 5. The 5th mistake is equally invisible until it's too late. And it's about feeding your plants at exactly the wrong times with exactly the wrong nutrients. Mistake number 5 is fertilizing like you're growing lettuce instead of fruit. Your plant is 3 feet tall, deep green, covered in beautiful leaves, and has absolutely 0 peppers forming. That's the signature of too much nitrogen at the wrong time doing exactly what it's designed to do. Here's the mechanism that confuses most beginners. Nitrogen drives vegetative growth, which means leaves and stems. Phosphorus and potassium drive reproductive growth, which means flowers and fruit. When you dump nitrogen-rich fertilizer on a pepper plant, you're literally telling it to make more leaves instead of peppers. The plant listens. The common error follows a predictable pattern. Beginners see a small seedling and think it needs help growing bigger, so they apply fertilizer with high nitrogen content like 20-10-10 or straight compost. The plant responds by becoming a massive leafy bush that looks incredibly healthy but refuses to flower. By the time the grower realizes something's wrong, they've already locked the plant into vegetative mode for weeks. Here's the timing correction that fixes this. During weeks 1 through 4, after transplanting, use a balanced fertilizer like 10-10-10. The plant needs some nitrogen during this phase to establish itself. During weeks 5 through 8, reduce nitrogen gradually. From week 9 onward, when the plant starts flowering, switch to a low nitrogen formula like 5-10-10 or 4-8-4. This shift tells the plant to stop making leaves and start making fruit. But there's a second fertilizer mistake that happens later in the season. People see peppers forming and think the plant doesn't need feeding anymore. They stop fertilizing completely. The plant runs out of nutrients mid-season, fruit production slows down, and the peppers that do form stay small. Peppers need continuous feeding all the way through harvest. The nutrient demand doesn't stop when fruit appears. It actually increases. Drop off your fertilizer schedule, and you're leaving pounds of potential harvest on the table. The specific solution involves 2 products used strategically. Apply slow-release granular fertilizer at transplant time to provide baseline nutrition. Then supplement with liquid fertilizer every 2 weeks during the fruiting phase. This combination keeps nutrient levels consistent without the boom-bust cycle that comes from irregular feeding. Now here's what ties these first 5 mistakes together, and it's something nobody talks about when they're selling you seeds or grow lights at the nursery. These 7 mistakes aren't separate problems. They're interconnected decisions that either compound into abundance or collapse into failure. If you overcrowd your plants and over-fertilize with nitrogen, you create a disease-prone leafy jungle that produces nothing. The mistakes reinforce each other. Let me show you what I mean with a specific example. Plant peppers in moisture-retaining soil, then overwater them because you think more water helps. The roots stay shallow and weak. Add high nitrogen fertilizer because the plant looks small. And now you've got a plant that's putting all its energy into leaves instead of developing a deep root system. Space 3 of these struggling plants 12 inches apart, and you've guaranteed that disease will spread when the inevitable fungal problems start. That's 4 mistakes compounding into total failure. Now let's talk about mistake number 6, which is actually about psychology more than horticulture: impatience. You harvest peppers when they're small and green because you can't wait for them to reach full maturity, or you pull your plants in September because you assume the season is over. Here's what most people don't understand about pepper ripening. Most varieties need 60 to 90 days from when the flower appears to when the fruit reaches full maturity. If you harvest at 30 days because you see a pepper forming, you're getting maybe a third of the flavor, and you're signaling the plant to stop producing. The plant thinks its job is done. Production drops off dramatically. Learning what ripe actually looks like for each variety changes everything. Jalapenos aren't fully mature when they're dark green and smooth. They're mature when they're dark green with slight corking and cracking on the skin. If you let them go longer, they turn red and get even sweeter. Habaneros need to develop their full deep orange color. Bell peppers should complete their entire color change from green to red or yellow, which takes an extra 3 to 4 weeks but doubles the sweetness. The secondary impatience mistake happens at the end of the season. People pull their plants in early September thinking frost is coming, when peppers in most climates will produce until the first hard frost, which might not happen until late October or even November. In warm climates, peppers are actually perennials. You're throwing away 30 to 50% of your potential harvest because you assumed the season was over. Which brings us to mistake number 7, growing varieties that don't match your climate or your actual goals. Super hot peppers in short season zones means you'll never get ripe fruit. Bell peppers in climates where summer temperatures hit 100 degrees means constant blossom drop. Ghost peppers, when what you actually wanted was mild peppers for fresh salsa, means wasted garden space. The correction requires answering 3 questions before you buy seeds. First, what's your frost-free growing period? Match varieties to days to maturity that fit your window with at least 2 weeks of buffer. Second, what are your summer high temperatures? If you regularly hit 95 to 100 degrees, avoid varieties that abort flowers in heat. Third, what will you actually use these peppers for? Fresh eating, hot sauce, drying, or pickling all require different varieties. But here's where most people completely mess this up, and it's not what you'd expect. They try to fix all 7 mistakes in one season, get overwhelmed, and quit growing peppers entirely. They go from making 7 mistakes to making 0 because they gave up. The smart approach isn't trying to master everything at once. Pick the 2 or 3 mistakes you're currently making and fix those first. If your seedlings keep dying in the first month, focus on mistakes 1 and 2. Get your soil right and stop overwatering. If your plants grow big but never produce fruit, tackle mistake 5 and get your fertilizer timing dialed in. If you're already growing successfully but want to increase yields, work on spacing and variety selection. Here's the thing about these mistakes. The ones you avoid this season become habits you carry forward automatically. Next year, you won't even think about checking soil moisture before watering. You'll just stick your finger in the soil out of habit. You won't debate whether to add more nitrogen. You'll automatically reach for the low nitrogen formula when flowers appear. Growing peppers isn't about achieving perfection in one season. It's about building systems that work year after year while everyone else restarts from 0 every spring because they never learned what actually matters. The mistakes you fix become knowledge you own. The knowledge you own becomes production you can count on. Your growing season will pass whether you fix these mistakes or not. The only question is whether you'll look back in October with 50 pounds of peppers stored in your freezer, or you'll be standing there wondering why gardening seems to work for everyone except you. These 7 mistakes aren't just about growing better peppers. They're about understanding that success in the garden comes from making better decisions during specific windows when those decisions actually matter. Pick one mistake from this list. Fix it this week. Start your seeds at the right time, or switch to proper soil, or give your plants room to breathe. Because next season, you'll either thank yourself for taking action today or wish you had.